Welcome to Session 6, Administrating Planning for Computing. In tonight's session, we're going to be looking at the kinds of planning that goes on that can facilitate and help the planning for technology in universities, business and industry, institutions, organizations, and agencies. In tonight's session, we're going to be looking at three separate things that we feel will help you to understand what administrative planning is all about and the kinds of things that you should consider in your own planning process. In the first session, we're going to be having a consultant and an expert come in to talk about the whole idea of what kind of planning really needs to be considered for technology. In our second piece, we're going to be talking about the whole idea of how certain case studies have really made a substantial difference in improving their technology base. In our third phase tonight, we're going to be talking to one of the students in the course who has developed a strategic management plan. She's going to be telling about that plan and looking at the kinds of ideas that have been presented throughout the 2 hours and reference those in light of what she can do to improve her own planning process. Before we get started tonight, I have with me Barry Prokop, who will be co-hosting the operation. And what we'd like to do for just a couple of minutes is to talk about the context that goes into this kind of planning initiative. Barry, I'd like to know something. Why has this kind of planning for technology, and particular strategic planning for technology, become so important over the last couple of years?
One of the biggest reasons, Reynolds, is to make higher education, to make companies more competitive. And technology is a very useful tool that's used by a lot of companies to make them more competitive. And over the last couple of years, the dynamics of technology and management strategies have changed radically. Also, the cost of technology has become more significant in budgets throughout higher education and other companies out there. There is also the issue of the complexity of technology. Now, you'll hear from a lot of vendors that technology is actually becoming easier to use and more widespread out in the organizations. But that's not the kind of complexity I'm talking about. The kind of complexity I'm talking about is actually integrating all those technologies together. We've heard time and time again when we have the Windows interface out there and the Macintosh environment, and those software packages are easy to use, but then you're going to throw in all kinds of new technology like CD-ROMs, information services, local area networks, and that is where the complexity comes in and where you really need to plan on exactly where you're going. Another point is in terms of expectations. Especially in higher education, the outside communities and especially the students expect more of their higher education environment. They want those higher education institutions to have, if not leading edge technology, current technology that they can transfer to the students who will then be able to take that technology out and into the workforce.
Barry, I'm a little concerned that with some of the changing dynamics that are going in technology that we're not going to be able to respond very quickly or very effectively. For example, the whole idea that almost everyone now realizes the necessity to have a computer network as part of their computing environment. It seems to be very difficult because of the cost factor to put on quickly in just about any kind of institution. Isn't this going to be a serious problem?
Well, it's a little bit of a problem, and it's not just computer networks. It's actually computers and computing technology. It could be a wide variety of different technologies that are going to be coming into play. And what makes it more difficult is exactly how you're going to use that technology, and that's where the planning piece comes in. What exactly are you going to use that technology for? What needs are you going to address? How is it going to accomplish the goals and objectives of your organization? And that's what really people need to focus on and plan for is how is this tool going to be used in the organization to make you more productive and more efficient and more effective?
You know, Barry, it used to be that you would have a need and you could react to that need and you'd buy some equipment and some software, and a lot of times you buy the equipment first and then you buy the software afterwards. And you would make it work for a while, and that would be fine. And there are a lot of computers sitting out there that are a product of that kind of planning.
Right, but what's happening now is all those technologies are becoming more integrated. There really isn't a standalone technology out there. If you've got a computer, you may have a modem attached to it, so you have to look at your telecommunication needs. If you have a computer, then you've got some software requirements and some interconnectivity requirements. And all those need to be planned for, and actually growth in there needs to be planned for. How exactly are you going to expand that capability so that more people can take advantage of it?
Well, maybe the day of just plain reactive planning where you could do that kind of thing are sort of over now?
I think they're definitely over now. You really need to get out there and focus in on what your needs are and plan for those needs if you're going to be competitive with other higher education institutions or other companies.
So the idea of just planning for a short window doesn't seem to be very rational or very practical.
If you plan for a short window, then you have to redo that plan after that window's over. And I think what we've talked about here, it's an evolutionary process. You're going to have to continue to do your planning throughout your organizational life. And companies need to keep looking at the technology because, as you know, the technology keeps changing. You buy something and by the time you get it, it's obsolete. Or the industry shifts to a new direction. Something's faster, bigger, better, bigger and bigger, bigger and bigger, bigger and bigger out there that people can use. So they have to plan for that. They have to look at that.
Well, in tonight's show, let's look at the factors. Let's look at the planning strategies and see whether or not they're really going to make a substantial difference in what we do. Because if we don't plan carefully and we don't know how to plan to get what we want, then it's not going to work in terms of the dynamics of technology that's out in the labor force today. So to discuss some of the concepts and case studies that are really important in understanding planning for technology, we have two guests with us tonight. We have Dr. Donald Norris, President and CEO of Strategic Initiatives. Strategic Initiatives is an organization that has dedicated itself to assisting organizations, agencies, universities and colleges to develop a transformation process that will lead them not only into technology but also into improving their entire administrative organization.
That's correct.
Don, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
We also have with us Mr. David Hollowell. David is the Vice President at the University of Delaware at Newark. David has been involved in a very interesting project in which he's been able to transform a very significant segment of his institution dealing with student services. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the show with us. And what we're going to ask you to do, Don, is to talk about the whole idea of planning for technology in consideration of this whole transformation process. I would like to point out to the audience tonight that we will let you know when it's time for phone calls, and we'll invite you to do so at that time. Don, would you like to start?
I'd love to, Reynolds. Thank you. In talking about technology planning tonight, there are three issues that I'd like to run through. First, I'd like to talk about some decision-making concepts and the context for planning for technology. I'd like, second, to talk about some concerns, problems, and issues. And third, to talk about transformation strategies, which are important because technology is key to transformation. So what are the decision-making concepts and the context for planning that we need to examine? Well, first of all, we need to examine the types of planning because there is more than one kind of planning, and different types of planning pertain in different settings. Secondly, we need to understand that decision-making must be supported by planning. At the current time, it is not. Indeed, decision-making must be driven by planning. And finally, it's critical for us to know that decision-making for information technology is changing, and the characteristics of these changes are very important for us as we do technology planning. So, what are the types of planning? Well, basically there are three: strategic, tactical, reactive, and problem solving. These three different types can occur in the same organization at the same time, dealing with different issues and problems. How about strategic planning? Well, there's no more misunderstood word in the English language than strategic. Strategic does not mean important, long-term, or decisive, although strategic planning can be all of those things. The word strategic and the term strategic planning means involving the relationship of the organization to its environment. That connection with the environment is what makes something strategic. Strategic planning must realign the organization with the changing environment, and strategic planning must occur whenever it is necessary to achieve such a realignment. Therefore, strategic planning doesn't necessarily occur every year with your budget cycle. It may have to occur every 3 months, episodically, or every 2 years if you're in a stable environment, which most of us, unfortunately, are not. Well, how about tactical planning? Most planning that goes on in organizations is tactical. Most organizational plans are tactical in nature, and they deal with today's challenges, or in some cases, even yesterday's. It is possible, however, for strategic planning to feed tactical planning. If an organization develops a new statement of strategic intent and strategic plans that realign itself with its environment, it can then generate tactical plans that can translate its actions into 1 to 3 year initiatives. That's tactical planning that's grounded in strategic thinking. Now, the third type of planning is also very important, and it's reactive or problem-solving planning. Most planning occurs in organizations in reactions to problems or crises. Often, one can use reactive planning on a crisis or a problem as a window to examine strategic issues that affect the organization in a far broader set of ways than just are dealt with in that problem. So sometimes problem-solving planning can actually become strategic in its focus and intent. Well, how must decision-making be supported by planning? Most planning processes, unfortunately, focus on the process and/or the plan. They are driven by the means, not the end. Planning of this type does not shape or make strategic decisions regarding the organization's future path. Moreover, most planning fails to make strategic decisions and to provide the insights necessary for leadership to use the results strategically. So therefore, we have found in studying planning processes in literally hundreds of organizations that most times planning fails. Well, when does it succeed? Well, when planning processes address strategic issues, they have to begin with measurable outcomes and measures of success. Because when most organizational planning processes begin with vision and mission, they don't have the measures necessary for the rank and file in the organization to really understand when they have achieved their ends. So what is wanted is planning that is transformational and indicator-driven. Planning must support the realignment of the organization with changing environments. This is fundamental. It must also be driven by what we call key performance indicators, KPIs, that measure success and enable everyone in the organization to understand when they are achieving the outcomes desired. Planning must support decision-making. No, it must drive decision-making. It must not be just ancillary to the decision-making process. It must be part of it. And planning must capture the changing decision-making environment for information technology. We are going through a fundamental set of changes in the way that decisions are made for information technology in our society today. These changes are having a basic and fundamental impact on planning for information technology. Let me review a series of about 6 or 7 ways in which planning tomorrow will be different from planning today. Decision-making for information technology is changing radically. Pre-1994, the old decision criterion was, what technology do we need to be up to date? In the future, the new decision criterion will be, what can technology do for me? And the president and executive officers will be asking and answering that question. Before 1994, it was appropriate and adequate to automate existing processes and to do things more efficiently. In the future, it will be necessary to re-engineer and to do things differently and better. In the past, we've treated technology as a capital expenditure rather than as an ongoing part of the organizational revenue stream. In the future, we will view technology as a recurring investment and a cost center that must be managed and planned for strategically. In the past, pre-1994, technologists have driven technology decisions and others have sat on the sidelines and watched. Post-1994, executive officers will drive technology decisions, users will drive, and they will all be actively involved. Pre-1994, application teams were user-influenced in deciding on applications. Today and in the future, re-engineering teams will be user-driven, and technologists and technology planners better get used to that situation. Pre-1994, the functionality of vendor products was the key evaluation criterion. In the future, not only functionality is important, but a vendor's overall strategy will be considered to be an essential evaluation criterion in the selection of vendors for particular products and for strategic alliances. And finally, in the past, technology and decision-making for information technology has been important, but in the future, it is essential to our survival and to our organizational health. So let's talk about transformational strategies. In dealing with this, I will be answering the question, what is transformation? And I will be talking about information technology as the key facilitator of organizational transformation. So what is this thing that we call transformation? The process of transformation has 4 distinct components, which we will proceed to discuss first in general and then in somewhat more specific terms. Transformation is the process of realigning organizational intent with the environment. Transformation is the process of redesigning the organization to achieve that new intent. Transformation is redefining the roles and responsibilities within the realigned, redesigned organization. And finally, transformation is re-engineering organizational processes to achieve dramatically higher productivity and quality. Now, many organizations, corporations, institutions, associations, agencies have undertaken pieces of this process. They have tried to restructure, they've tried to retrench, they've tried to re-engineer, but re-engineer without realigning the organization with the environment. All of these approaches have proven to be inadequate. In order to really transform the organization, you have to do the realignment, the redesign, the redefinition, the re-engineering in an integrated sort of way. This is why transformation has proven illusory and elusive to many organizations. They haven't been able to put together the pieces. Well, let's talk a little bit more about these 4 pieces. First of all, realigning organizational intent with the environment. The leaders of the organization, be it a college or university, a corporation, an association, or whatever, must monitor and understand their environment, and they must understand the implications of environmental changes on the organization. Organizational leaders must be able to translate environmental signals into institutional responses. So many of our leaders engage in environmental scanning and other kinds of environmental manipulation that don't really react and reflect how those environmental changes really affect the institution. It's necessary to translate those changes into the organization. Stakeholders, shareholders, and clients are assessing organizational performance continually. That's the performance of your organization. And leaders need to be open to the evaluation signals that they receive. So many times our leadership are immune to the way publics are responding to us until too late. And finally, leadership must provide a statement of strategic intent to depict those realignments. Many of our leaders find it impossible to translate mission and vision statements into hard-hitting, compelling, and understandable statements of strategic intent. This is what organizations need to motivate the energies of their publics and their members and constituents behind strategy, is statements of strategic intent that convey intentionality and vision. Well, how about redesign? Redesigning the organization. We must redesign our organizations to achieve the new strategic intent that is expressed by leaders. Organizations of the 21st century will be flatter with fewer layers of management. We all know this is true, and let us not be deceived. The 1990s are the first decade of the 21st century. Organizations of the 21st century will be networked, more flexible, and more responsive. They will not be hierarchical. They will not use information as a weapon and a tool that is marshaled and husbanded by individuals. Information will be shared and will enable these new redesigns. This will be reflected in the kind of workers that will be involved in our organizations and indeed are today. The dominant employee in the 21st century organization will be the self-motivated, techno-literate knowledge worker. What this means is that person on the front line who's working with your customers, be they students, be they customers of a commercial product, be they faculty, be they recipients of benefits from an agency. This frontline employee will be using information systems to be a knowledge worker. Work will be organized around outcomes and processes, not tasks, and client service orientation will be critical. Most of our organizations today in education, medicine, law, and other areas are provider-driven rather than client-driven. Corporations that have not been client-driven and customer-driven have failed. We will find these other organizations that do not become client-driven will also fail. Much of the pressure behind healthcare reform, behind educational reform, and behind legal reform is based on the fact that these professions have been provider-driven and must become customer-driven. Well, let's go to redefining roles and responsibilities. How will this be reflected? Individuals with keen communication skills who are able to deal with ambiguity will flourish. And by the way, those people must be both techno-literate and they must be good communicators. Individuals will be held accountable for outcomes, not tasks, and our planning has to recognize this. And finally, reengineering. Reengineering can be defined and is defined as using the power of modern information technology to radically redesign business processes in order to achieve dramatic improvements in organizational performance. It requires an organization-wide information technology strategy. Many organizations try to re-engineer without that technology strategy and that technology infrastructure in place, and mostly they fail. You have to have that in place in order to succeed. Now, you can launch some initiatory projects without having that strategy in place, but in order for this to be successful institutionally, you have to have that strategy functioning. Re-engineering processes and systems require some special thinking. It requires individuals who are able to think out of the box, that is, to dispel old ways of doing things, to think about new ways of attacking problems and organizing. And some of the wonderful examples that Dave Hollowell will provide later in his case description will really illustrate how thinking out of the box is possible using information technology as the fundamental tool of reengineering. Processes and systems are designed around technology. Of all the transforming elements in our cultures and activities, information technology is the one thing that enables us to do things fundamentally differently, not just more efficiently, but differently than ever before. So it is the crown jewel of the tools of transformation. The old adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, is wrong when it comes to organizational operation. One has to ferret out and be in a seeking mood all the time to find areas that, while they are functioning adequately, are certainly candidates for some kind of reengineering or improvement. And finally, in reengineering, quality is built in, not inspected in. You have to find a way in your processes to make this happen. As I said, information technology is the key facilitator of organizational transformation. It is necessary but not sufficient. There are other things that are important as well, but leave us not forget, without information technology, most of the transformation schemes that people talk about would be impossible. Well, let's talk about using the tools of transformation and how to use information technology as that key facilitative tool. It is the heart, it is the key, but there are other useful tools, among them being strategic planning, strategic management, organizational redesign, strategic enrollment management, executive information systems, assessment and evaluation systems, and total quality management. In looking at organizations and helping them to transform, my colleagues and I find leverage points and ways of focusing on products and services and activities that can be redirected toward a transformational bent. And let's talk about a couple of technology-based transformational opportunities that exist in colleges and universities. First, the one-card system, smart card-based systems that enable the campus to give students, faculty, and other community members, campus community members, the ability to have a debit card or a credit card and to pay for transactions. This seems like a simple enough tool, but when you start to think about the transformational possibilities, for example, of giving that kind of card to all of the commuter students at a university like George Washington University and incorporating on that card the ability for them to nest their other credit cards and things on that card so that they can use it not only for university transactions, but other transactions, including different ways of interacting with the campus. And you see that there's a tremendous transformational power there. Touch-tone registration, online advising, these kinds of things have been successfully used in many campuses. In-house publishing on demand to change the way that faculty provide courseware and the materials to support courses. Executive information systems and decision support systems. Academic bulletin boards as ways of facilitating communication between faculty, administration, and staff. Academic mail, voice electronic, and fax, obviously. Electronic classrooms and bringing technology into the classroom. The great undiscovered frontier in higher education for transformation is on the instructional side. While tonight's class is certainly not an example, most of the technologies that are implied in our colleges and universities begin with the idea that the overhead projector is the greatest technological advance of the 20th century. We have to do better than that. Information kiosks, the personalized system of instruction, that is, personalizing instruction so that individuals can get instruction that is key to their way of learning, to their pattern of learning. Other transformational tools include fax mail, fax on demand, multimedia learning systems, student retention and intervention systems, and direct electronic learning and teaching alternatives. Transformation is coming to education. It is coming to the administration of colleges and universities. It is coming to the instruction in our classrooms. We have to get out in front of this. We have to find ways to push the leverage points, to transform, to change cultures, to get faculty and administrators working together and to be champions of this idea. We will be talking later tonight about some case studies of colleges, universities, and other organizations that have achieved that kind of buy-in to transformation.
At this time, we would like to have your questions in regard to Don Norris's presentation. We're ready to take your questions at this time. Don? Yeah, Don, really appreciated that. I think you've covered enough about strategic planning to give us all some thought on what we ought to consider when we do it for our own colleges and universities or organizations in which we work. Is there any kind of real critical issue that you feel that would apply specifically to a college or university that they don't ordinarily take into consideration during the transformation process?
Well, I think from the perspective of technology planning, most of our people in colleges and universities and other organizations for that matter who are dealing with technology planning have not made that switch that I talked about from pre-1994 to post-1994 thinking. We have to get our technology planners thinking more broadly, and we have to get our planners who are dealing with programmatics issues and functions on the administrative and academic side to be better versed in the potentials of technology and to include technology in their thinking. If we can do that and get those groups working together, especially in cross-functional teams, then we're going to be able to achieve this integration of technology and programmatic planning that will be both strategic and transformational in its impact.
There's another piece to that, and we talk about trying to get the users to be more involved and more understanding of the technology. The other side of that is getting the technologists more knowledgeable about how the institution works.
Yes.
And bringing them more into the centrality of the management of the institution, so they have a better appreciation for what it is they're trying to automate, and can get in the shoes of the user as well.
Don, throughout your presentation, you inferred that everyone has to be included in this process, from the top manager right down to the final person that would be impacted by this, the user. In fact, it's the student if it's a university. How difficult of a task is that to have if in the kinds of plans you're proposing? Is that really that essential in transformation?
It's essential, and it can be difficult if it's not addressed in the proper way. See, the basic point is that we need to plan for technology to be an enabler. And it needs to be an enabler that enables that frontline knowledge worker that is going to be, that not is going to be, in many organizations is today, the fundamental person whom we're counting on to run the organization. That person needs to have on their desktop the ability to do analyses and develop support information relating to their job, and to do it in a way that is seamless, and they have the ability to develop their own applications. We have to get out of the situation where applications, where the technology staffs have an application stranglehold on the organization because of a 2-year backlog in applications requests that cannot be dealt with. It's a Gordian knot that cannot be broken, that cannot be untied. We have to cut it. And what we have to do is develop approaches that enable the users to solve their own needs, to develop their own systems, their own applications. And much of the open architecture and object-oriented programming that's being developed is being developed with that kind of functionality in mind.
It just seems, though, that you're recommending a kind of process that will cause institutions to totally reconsider the way in which they normally plan. Let's take a call from Mark Root at the present time, and by all means, let's listen to Mark. And Mark, would you
Sure.
please give your question now?
Yes, this question is directed to Dr. Norris.
Okay.
I was listening to your comments, and I must say I agree with a lot of what you said. And you were talking about organizations of the future in being more client-oriented than provider-oriented.
Yes.
And I was just really kind of just wondering what the difference is between those two methods of providing services to your...
It's a very good question, Mark, and I think a good way to think about it is first from the frame of reference, first of all, think of colleges and universities, medical organizations, and legal organizations. All of them are people who are very concerned about their profession. They're very concerned about the service that they're providing, and we have built large institutions to support those individuals and those professions. But those institutions, by and large, have been developed and cultivated to the needs of the providers, not to the needs of the clients. And the clients and customers in a university are not just the students. They are employers, they are graduate schools, they are faculty themselves for the administrative services of the organization. They are other administrators. So the notion of who is a client and a customer in all these organizations is complicated. But what we need to think about in all of these entities is what do we need to do to satisfy the needs and wants of the client, the customer, the beneficiary, whomever they may be, and how can we provide whatever product and service we're providing in a way that meets those needs and wants. And that's the fundamental basis of an organization being customer driven.
We have a call on the line from Jeff Rossen. Jeff, you want to state your question now?
Hi.
Hi.
Yes, I do have a question that's more like a scenario I'd like to pose both to Mr. Norris and Mr. Hollowell, if you'd each
All right.
care to address it.
Okay.
I was brought to the realization in a personal experience recently that a lot of strategies that corporations have for the 1990s are linked to downsizing. I'd like to ask both of your guests how they would plan for using the information technology to retrain their workforce as opposed to laying them off if they were doing a strategic plan for a large corporation.
That's really an excellent question, Jeff, and it is true that most of the productivity gains that have been won recently have been reflected in downsizing. When I counsel with organizations on this particular issue, I talk with them about what the increase in productivity does in terms of increasing the resources that they have available to pursue new opportunities. And most of the colleges and universities and associations that I'm consulting with see it in that way, that it is a way to go after new learning opportunities, to go after new service opportunities, to realign the organization, to be able to do things that it hasn't done before. And I think that's a much more agreeable way to approach the issue.
We have, I believe, one more quick question. Katherine Travers. Katherine, are you on the line?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Perfectly. Yeah, by all means, Katherine.
This is a question for Dr. Norris. It's a fairly theoretical one, I have to admit. I got kind of dizzy. I liked it, but I was dizzy thinking about all this realigning, reengineering, redesigning, and I'm wondering whether, in your experience, you have ever found companies that go so far in that extreme that they actually run the danger of losing their identity. It seems to me that a corporate identity is a fairly critical issue, and that if one is too trendy and changes too often, chameleon-like, that one really runs the risk of losing one's identity.
Well, that's a very good point, and of course we all know of corporations that have failed because they've lost focus. They've tried to do things that they don't do well. We're familiar with corporations that have focused too much on means rather than ends, and the example of the corporations that have done the Baldrige Award and put so much effort into it that they've lost focus what they're really about. There's a handful of cases like that, and sure, it's possible for a corporation to make bad choices in realigning itself and misaligning itself with its environment. So you raise a very good point, and it can happen.
When we come back, we're going to have a case study from David Hollowell. Our first case study tonight will be presented by David Hollowell, Vice President of the University of Delaware, who's going to be talking about the kind of experience he has had in transforming his institution as he's carried out work in the last couple of years there. David?
Thank you, Reynolds. In some ways, I'm going to have to go back to the future, Don, talking about these processes that are post-94. This is a project that we started at the University of Delaware in actually 1988, which encompasses a number of the concepts that you just described. A little background, the University of Delaware is located in Newark, which is in northern Delaware. It's a private chartered state-assisted university of about 21,000 students, 15,000 undergraduates. I was recruited to the University of Delaware in 1988 at the time of a change of administrations with, among other things, a mandate to re-engineer or to revamp all of the administrative systems and procedures. And there were many of them that needed attention. In doing a bit of an environmental scan and looking at where the institution was going and seeing that we were going off a growth curve to a more level enrollment, that competition for students was getting to be greater, listening around the campus to students and their feeling that they were not being well served administratively, we chose to focus first on student information systems areas. And it was also true as we looked at it that many of the areas, we talk about admissions and financial aid and so forth, had very minimal computer support. So we focused on those things and we found that they were characterized by a lack of teamwork between the offices. Most of the offices didn't know how the others worked. Students felt that they were run around the campus. Things were not well organized. There was a perception of an uncaring staff, but after examination, it wasn't that we had an uncaring staff. It was just that they didn't have the tools to do the job that they were being asked to do. So we looked at it and figured that what we really needed to do was to put together a computer system that was integrated across all the student areas. And I formed a student information systems steering committee, and talking about being user-driven, Don, the chair of that was the registrar, and we had representatives on it for each of the major user areas and the management information systems people. And there were very specific charges to this group. We asked them to develop specifications for an integrated student information system. But they were to look at, after they developed the specifications, to examine what existed in the marketplace. There were a number of student information system packages available. Also, our management information staff had been developing some things on their own, evaluate where they were going and see if it made sense. Also gave them a very strict timeline of 6 months to come back to us with a plan. And they got together and started working on that. And the first thing, it's like the issue of what shape should the table be. This was a group of people that neither had the motivation or incentive to work together before. And there really was a period of time that took them to understand why were they really doing this. Some didn't feel we needed to do it. People really didn't understand, even at the level of the directors of these offices, how the whole thing hung together. So we had to overcome that lack of understanding and knowledge. There were a number of goals that we presented to the committee that we wanted them to look at, emphasizing quality and efficiency of service. We wanted to do the job better and also more efficiently. To look at it in a team orientation, both at the level of management and at the level of staff, and that we really wanted a fully integrated online student information system. A number of objectives that we presented at the same time. One, that we wanted to employ technology to its fullest. The campus had, and particularly on the academic side, done a number of things that were a bit ahead of their time in terms of implementing a fiber optic network around the campus. There were some database systems that had been installed, and they'd drawn stuff off of kind of archaic file structures and put them up on databases so one could acquire against them at least. And we wanted to integrate what were 5 then separate systems, 5 sets of names and address files. It was just unbelievable, into a single system, and we wanted to make it accessible across the campus wherever it was needed. We also continued to emphasize the issue of teamwork, that we wanted the units to work together, that we wanted to focus on institutional goals over individual departmental goals. And that we said from the beginning we'd be willing to reorganize if it was necessary. Some institutions that have addressed this particular issue have started out by saying, well, let's create a mega office and put together all of these various student services units into a single unit. And that hasn't worked particularly well, because they really look at what is the service that needs to be provided and then how best to provide that service. One of the things that would set me off real quick is when someone came back to me and said, well, we do it that way because that's the way we've always done it. And that's a red flag to me. It's not to say that the way it had been done necessarily was the wrong way, but we needed to examine all the past practices. A lot of the policies were really archaic and had not been revisited in many years. We had to streamline procedures, stop having people autograph pieces of paper that really didn't add any value to the process. Become more user-friendly. One of the things that the phrases the president had coined was, think of yourself as a student. How would you like to be treated this way? And that got a lot of people thinking. These areas reported to 4 different vice presidents within the organization, so that even made it more important to have top-level support. As being the senior operating officer for the institution, at my level, that gave me a lot of leverage to get others to cooperate. But also the president was firmly behind this, and he was actively involved and came to several of the meetings to make sure that everybody understood he wanted it to happen. So we made sure that everybody understood results were expected. And we provided the support for change and the implementation of the systems, and this meant moral support as well as monetary to purchase software, to purchase equipment, to provide training. This was a process that started out in spring of '88, and the implementation was not until 1991, so it was a fairly lengthy process to evaluate, select, install software. But there were a number of things that we could do in the interim, and we made sure that we did a lot of training of staff and service techniques, telephone manner, how other offices worked, how they fit in, so they knew what the piece they were doing, how it related to the other aspects of student services. We put a telephone drop ad system in, but you called up and talked to a person. It was a phase 1. And we started to connect college and departmental offices to the systems as we developed bits and pieces so that the departments would get used to using what was there and recognizing that there would be more to come. So in the implementation, we had several colleges and departments online from the beginning. All the colleges and departments now have access to the systems. We implemented, Don mentioned, touch-tone registration. We now have a touch-tone system for registration, drop ad. And interestingly, we've expanded that for the winter session that just ended. Students could call up and use the touch-tone system to get their grades. And we will have campus-wide access. We've been continuing to cable a campus, and we will have network connections in every office on the campus by this fall. We have them in every dorm room as of last summer. And really what we're doing is empowering the staff to do a better job by providing those tools, by providing the training. And this has worked well. But it got to a point where we provided the systems, we provided the training. It was working well, but we still had the problem of a lot of these offices being decentralized. So we then thought about how could we consolidate the operations, and we had the opportunity to present itself as it was an office, a small office research building in the center of the campus that was being used by a startup company that one of our faculty developed that was successful, and they needed more space, and they moved out of the campus. So we had this building available to us, and we decided we would, as a high priority again for student service, to renovate this building into a student services building. And we focused on the design process, again focusing on analyzing the process and the services that were required, and how could they be most efficiently delivered. And we started thinking about how could we utilize, again, the technology and just to have students be serviced by making as few contacts as possible, maybe even 0. Rather than having to see a person, they could solve their own problems by using the technology. Interesting, in this design process, the first thing the group wanted to do, and I used the same group of people to do the building design, was that, well, let's bring in the architect and sit down and start drawing layouts. Well, I kept saying, no, you've got to think about process. How can you best service the student? And don't think about the way you're doing it now in your dislocated locations, but how could we do it in a central location? And at the same time, we're also trying to build enthusiasm with the staff. They were thinking this is something different and problematic. They couldn't see around how this might work out. So we did an analysis and looked at the types of services that were being provided to students. And we kind of look at almost in some ways like a bank. That about 20% of the services that were being requested were called self-help. The information packets, drop boxes, things that could be serviced through the computer system using information kiosks that Don mentioned in his presentation. Then there were a number of issues that were routine assistance, where most anyone that had access to the tools of the computer system and some basic training could answer. And this is ID cards and cashier services, and registration, parking permits, student paychecks, all those types of things. And only about 20% of the processes were things that really required some level of expertise. So we looked at specialized assistance as being the other aspect of that. So we looked at then the design criteria. At that point, it was okay to bring the architect in, And we designed looking at having a lobby, information lobby with kiosks, frontline staff, we'll call the generalists, and then behind that, individuals who were the specialists. And we looked at having minimal staffing on the front lines when it was needed, and people that were in the back that could be pulled forward to help support the operation. What I'd like to just real quickly run through a few slides to illustrate the space issues. At the first slide, if we could have of this is the basement of the administration building, a narrow corridor. You can see the steel grate, that was the registration area. Cashier's area is just down the hall from that. It didn't look much better. So talk about user-friendly. Plus at registration times, they were up the stairs, out the door, down the hall, everything else. Then we look at the next slide. We have this building that we found, and it took a lot of morale building to get people to think of this as being something that would help. But in the next slide, you'll see what this looked like afterwards. And by using a little stucco and a little wood, we made the building tie in much more attractively to the Georgian nature of the campus. On the inside, we flip to the next slide. Again, we had to use a lot of imagination. This is what it looked like when the prior tenants moved out. But then, if we look at the next few slides in a row, this is the general services area desk in the lobby. We go to the next slide. This is the area we put the staff in partial height petition so that if someone's at the counter and needs specialist help, you could point over and say, there's Mrs. Smith, and she'll be able to help you right away. We look at the next slide. And this is where the specialists in the back, again, very user-friendly area. And then if we can go on to the next slide, this is the kiosks. We have these computer terminals in the lobby area again, and the sign above it with a list of services. And see the next slide. Very popular. The lines got away from being in front of people and now are in front of computer terminals, and that's easier to solve. We can go on to the next slide. Back to the text again. The results is we have a student services building that was very well received. It's the most visible outcome of the 5-year effort to develop our student information systems and more student-friendly systems. It's part of a broader effort to improve the campus environment for students in terms of recreational space, and we've renovated all the classrooms and dining facilities and so forth. And the positive changes really are evident. We really feel that the students have reacted positively to it. We're continuing to evaluate. We've added services to the building without adding staff. We feel it's generated a lot of goodwill with the students, whether that will pay off in terms of them telling their friends that Delaware is a good place to go, or making them more generous when it comes time for alumni contributions, remains to be seen. But kind of one of the things that when you're on a campus and have to deal with student newspapers, that when it says something nice about you, you feel good. If we can put up that, this is out of at the end of the year, in May, the Review, which is a student newspaper, puts in its cheers and jeers section, and it made a point of saying how positive the student services building was and how much they liked it. So that made us all feel very good. So that we really feel this has been a very interesting project, and it has employed a lot of the issues that Don raised in his presentation, even ahead of its time.
It sounds like you spent a lot of time in planning this all out. Did it take that long to do it, or was it done in fairly quick time frame?
It started in April of '88, and it took, it was actually fairly, when you think about it, a fairly rapid process, but it did take a period of a couple of years to get the systems up and incremental improvements. We rolled things out incrementally, so it wasn't like nothing happened for 3 years and all of a sudden we brought things out in pieces.
Well, when we come back, David, we're going to provide the opportunity for the students and those in the class to ask questions.
Okay.
And we'll be able to, at that time, ask questions not only of you if you want, but also of Don. We have Anna Dorshaw on the line. Anna, can you hear me okay? While we're waiting for Anna or our next caller.
Hello?
Hello, Anna.
Oh, good. You got me.
Great. Okay. Could we have your question now?
Well, it's partly a comment and partly question. It seems
Okay.
as though the way you approached what you needed to do at the University of Delaware was to place a lot of emphasis on your process. It sounds as though you were looking for collaboration and consensus and that you were trying to involve all your stakeholders. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the planning that went into making that happen, how you came to use this process.
I guess it wasn't trying to do the process, but rather kind of my own philosophy of managing was to bring people together and try to have them work through and understand and be part of the solution, so that it wasn't anything particularly well planned out in terms of a process, other than to get people together and to be very clear what was expected in timelines and push them to bring it out of themselves, and it worked real well.
I'd like to comment a little bit on the importance of process and the importance of getting people to work together in different ways. We found some interesting things in the field in working through quality processes and customer services processes and re-engineering processes. People behave the way they behave because of beliefs and values that they hold. And the standard thinking years ago was that in order to change the way people behave, you have to change their values. Well, most of us realize that changing people's values takes a long time, and you need pretty strong evidence to do it. What the people in the quality field and the customer service field have found is that what you do, if you want people to behave differently, you get them working in teams where they have to work together differently, and they see that that works. And you get them together in the kinds of teams that Dave used, and you get them to see that this is a better way of thinking about how to do the kind of thing they need to do. And what that does is that changes their values and beliefs about what works and what doesn't. And you can't do that by lecturing at them or by telling them that this is what you need to do to transform an organization. So this is why when you want to transform and change, you get particular groups working on things that are definable, that are whole, that are identified as essential to the organization. You solve those, and by doing that, you have sent a signal to the organization that this is a better way to function. And this is a wonderful case example of that.
Okay. Are we ready for another call? Fine. Jane Noel, are you? Can you hear us?
Hi, this is Jane Noel. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
I'm at a branch location of our organization, and at the upper levels there are a number of supported initiatives which we've benefited at our location. But I also see ideas that we could initiate here to help improve the efficiency. But unfortunately, we have a chief officer at this organization which does not necessarily see things from the bottom up and is much more hierarchical. Is there any way that one can kind of work at the flattening of the organization from the bottom, other than being that constant drop of water and sort of wearing things away?
I've got a couple of perspectives on that. You know, when you talk to people about organizational change and about quality processes and whatever, they always tell you that you have to have CEO or the commitment of the CEO or your boss in order to make things happen. And in the long run, this is true. In order for any of these processes to work, you have to have the kind of commitment, for example, that Dave Rozelle had at the University of Delaware, and he talked the talk and walked the walk and did it all. But a lot of times you have to start before you have that. And we've done some work with organizations that did not have that, and have found that that people in positions like yours have to find ways to plant seeds, to try ideas, to test, to build allies, and to work so that you can show your boss that these new ways of doing things do work. because you're not going to get his commitment and support, but you can't afford to wait for him to be replaced. And so I would encourage you to find ways to try to find allies and get projects going where you can demonstrate that some different ways of doing things are actually good business. And that's the way to win that guy or gal over that hasn't quite gotten it yet.
We have another call from Jeff Rossen. Jeff?
Hello.
Please.
Yes, I'd like to say first that I'm really enjoying this program. There's quite a bit of information being transmitted here, but I'd like to address my question to a business concern I have. And I guess Mr. Hollowell would be the right person to answer this question. About 10 years ago, I was involved in making a promotional videotape for the University of Southern California, who had just installed their new student information system. I was wondering if, like USC, you had to sell people on the idea of the SIS, including the contributing alumni, and that led me to my question, which is, you said earlier you had established these goals of doing things better. It struck me as a kind of a vague measurement of productivity, so I wondered, do you have an actual way that you can calculate the university's return on their investment?
I think probably the honest answer to that is no. I was familiar with the USC process, and had read a number of the pieces that they put out on that. And they use some of the same technology that we employ, but they were on the bleeding edge rather than the cutting edge of that, I think. Really, the focus was much more qualitative than quantitative, and just the feeling that if we could improve the quality of service and the efficiencies, and you know, we are able to measure in some quantitative ways in terms of we have reduced a little bit on staffing, but it's mostly been we've reduced a lot on overtime and heavy use of part-time people at peak periods, at the same time improving services tremendously. You know, we're getting grades out faster, we're getting registrations processed faster, we get our bills out faster, so we're getting our money in faster. There's a whole number of these things, but have we sat down and really analyzed, you know, dollar for dollar what the cost benefit has been? No, we honestly haven't. But what we're doing is looking at ways we can utilize the basis we've got to continue to introduce efficiencies. We've added a lot of services to the student services building without adding any staff at all, which is a way of saving some money in the end. And you know, we didn't have to market it to our alumni. Hopefully, as the students that are making use of this graduate, they'll become happier alumni. I mentioned that before, and we always hope that we'll have happy alumni. But it was much more of a qualitative rather than a quantitative approach.
We'd like to provide an opportunity now for Diane Garcia to raise a question. Diane?
Good evening. My question is for Mr. Hollowell. It's evident that your strategic planning paid off, but how do you really maintain the reforms that you started? And referring back to your previous statement, how do you monitor your progress?
I guess, you know, the issue of how do you sustain it is one of continuing to monitor, continuing to review, not simply saying, okay, we've got this far, it's working fine, let's just forget about it and go on to something else. I mean, we're doing that with some of the resources that have been working on the systems part of that and doing other things systems-wise. But one of the points to make, the building has 3 major administrative units working in it that are under 3 different vice presidents still. And rather than reorganizing it, we left the organization the way it is. But we have the building is run by a management team of 3 people. One from each of those major areas. And so they are still working together as a team, making decisions about how, and coming back with recommendations, and they're making recommendations on how to refine and make things better. So that we've got the teamwork thing going, and it's really held on. So that I think that will sustain it, and it's something that, at least as long as I'm at the university, you know, I keep a close eye on these things to make sure that they're not you know, laying back and saying, gee, everything's great and we don't need to think any more about how we're doing.
Dave, I might suggest that now that you're at this stage in your development, you probably are at a point now that you've really seen how the students are using this capability, that you could identify some key performance measures for customer satisfaction relating to what students can do in terms of the functionality, how long it takes them to do that, and I know you've got statistics on those kinds of things. But you could really formulate the functioning of the one-stop shopping aspect of your facility in that way. And it's hard to do that at the early stages, especially when you're really transforming. But then once you start to see how it's functioning, you can lay those out, and those would become the drivers that would drive the team in figuring out how can we cut this down. And then you'd have to ask the students, how long do we want, are we willing to take to do this? How much do we want to do in our rooms as opposed to the information kiosks? All sorts of different kinds of measures emerge, some of which are qualitative, but some of which are quantitative too.
And that's the major place where we're looking now, is that how much of the stuff that we're doing at the kiosks in the Student Services building can we put out across the network? And their issues of security, of course, are a major concern, but that's where we're heading.
We have a call now from Charles Knapp. Charles?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I have a question for David. I was wondering, it seems like there was a big change in your staff and administrative personnel when you went through this process. And I was wondering, how much retraining did you do? And did you have to hire additional people for technical support? Or was that contractor-based? Or how did you handle the technical increase in technical capabilities that you've done?
Actually, there was not a major change. The major change in staffing was a new president and me. The registrar, the director of admissions, the head of billing collection, they're all the same people today that were there in 1988. And most of the staff, the frontline staff, are the same frontline staff that were there in 1988. So it has been a situation where we've taken the people that were there, brought them along, trained them, got them enthusiastic about, and this is let me just relate one quick story about how the people that were on the front line, a number of people who had been in these offices for a lot of time and had been doing it the same way forever. And we showed them, we took them over and showed them this building before we started renovating it. And the president met with them and said what the concept was, and hoping they'd understand. And they were reluctant, to say the least. But it's interesting that one of the big things on campus is the lunchtime walk. You put on your sneakers and go out and take a hike. And that became the place people went at lunchtime. And those staff would go over there every lunchtime and see how the progress was coming. And the enthusiasm built and built. And when they moved in, I mean, they really just bought the whole concept. And it has worked tremendously well. The technology part is we had an MIS group that was technologically quite advanced. And they were able to take the concepts and work with we didn't acquire a package. And it happened to be a package that we had a piece of our only system that was really in any shape at all was registration, and that had been the same vendor some 15 years earlier. So they were able to adapt the technology fairly well. So we were able to use the people that were in place and work with them.
Wasn't one of the keys, Dave, that since you were buying an off-the-shelf package and were modifying the way that you were doing business to suit the capabilities of that, you really could use the training to that new capability as a training device.
That certainly was a major issue.
Okay. What kinds of major problems did you have in this?
I guess it was overcoming the initial inertia and getting people to work together and agree on the common goals. But once we overcame that, it moved fairly well. Then the issues of dealing with a vendor and getting a software package in and getting it installed and data converted, and it always takes longer than you would hope it would. But it went fairly smoothly.
In just about a minute, we're going to open it up again for question and answers to Don. Before we do that, Don, is there any one major area that you could discuss very briefly before we went into allowing students to raise questions?
You mean relating to David's activities or just in general?
No, just in general. Too.
Well, one thing that I'd like to actually ask Dave was one of the things that's I've always admired about this particular project was the way that you put it together and achieved transformational ends without ever calling it transformation. And it's certainly my experience that sometimes you have to undergo a stealth transformation process in order to avoid raising too many flags. Would you talk a little bit about that?
I think some of that's my own personal philosophy. I don't like alphabet soup in terms of all the various types of processes. I mean, even at the TQM and continuous quality improvement, like CQI or whatever. It's more focused on the concepts and what the objectives are, not to say here we're going to do TQM, and some people say, well, what the heck is that, and get scared off by the term, but rather to talk about the objectives and use the concepts.
Well, Don, I know that you've worked up a couple of case studies. Could you tell us about one of these case studies?
Yes, I'd like to share a couple of mini descriptions. Nothing as extensive as David had about the Delaware situation, but just to give you some other examples of how technology is being used in information technology in a transformational way in a number of different kinds of organizations. And I'm just going to quickly talk about three. George Mason University. This is not an institution, but it's a transformational initiative that's been launched by Sally May and Cybermark, which is a new entity of the subsidiary dealing with information technology infrastructure. And then I want to talk also about a medical association that I can't name that we've been helping with an interesting transformational application of technology. First of all, George Mason. Many people are acquainted with George Mason University as an interesting institution in Northern Virginia across the Potomac from where we are right now that has styled itself as a distributed interactive university. What this means is from 4 or 5 campus locations and from many other locations and businesses and companies and learning centers where they do and will have learning center connections. They see themselves as a campus that literally spans Northern Virginia and is dedicated to serving the learners there in a variety of ways. And technology is critical to this because in order to be a distributed university, the notion is each of the campuses has some anchor programs that are world-class programs and distinctive to that campus, but then the campus is linked together with technology systems and administrative systems that enable students and faculty and administrators to interact seamlessly, and for a student on any one of the campus nodes to be treated the same way no matter where they are. Well, obviously critical to this are new ways of distributing both instruction and administration, and therefore it's very important that technology play a key role in this. And this is being reflected there at George Mason in the way not only that they're wiring the campus, but the way they're conceiving of the information infrastructure, the way they're conceiving of their buildings. Their new university center is a combination of a electronic learning center, a student union, a food court, and administrative services, especially those relating to technology, all under one roof. And the buildings that they're putting in the various campuses around Northern Virginia will probably be multi-use facilities that are designed to integrate the learning and lifestyle needs of both residential and commuter students. So this is a very interesting approach. Now the second example of this subsidiary of Sally May that is Cybermark, that is looking at information technology in higher education, is an important one, because what they are doing is they're pulling together the capacity, they believe, to make available to colleges and universities the ability to borrow to build the infrastructure they need, and then to pay off a large portion of that, perhaps not all of it, but certainly a large portion, using the revenues from new kinds of integrated applications of smart cards and other things. Much of this technology that's been applied on other campuses, the smart card technology, for example, has been done in such a small-scale pilot project way that it really has not harvested either the service or the revenue potentials. But what they are doing is they're putting together a really first-class operation and activity in order to make this happen on a large-scale basis and to give campuses the ability to invest in information technology and their infrastructure not as a capital expenditure, but as a real investment on which there would be a revenue stream to return. Now, some of the aspects of this are kind of neat in the sense that many of these smart card applications have been limited on campuses because they have been proprietary systems that have been limited only to the students that are on the campus. And the systems that they're talking about are open systems architectures that would literally involve any and all vendors. And they're also would be applied not just to the students while they're on the campus, but to commuting students and others in their other dealings. So this is a much more powerful potential application. Finally, the third example is a medical association that we've been working with that I can't name because of the sensitivity of the project. But this organization has been using technology as a way of changing the way they're delivering some of their core services to go from a period and a mode of delivery of 30-day turnaround to literally instantaneous turnaround using information technology as a mechanism for supporting that. And what this organization is doing is that they are trying to run their existing products and services on the 30-day turnaround, but using the technology to be able to have instantaneous turnaround on this new set of products and services that would literally redefine what that activity is. And I can't say more about it because it's proprietary and a very sensitive stage right now. But the point is that they're using technology to fundamentally change what is the core product in their product and service mix. And I purposefully chose examples here that are non-commercial to show you that there can be transformational activities that don't have a strong commercial basis. They're based on what are the needs of colleges and universities or associations which are nonprofit entities.
In the case of the George Mason University example, you're looking at something that probably would take a couple of years to implement.
Oh, it'll take at least 5 years, I would say, to put the full infrastructure in place, including the new buildings. But they have these initiatives cooking in order for that to happen. Obviously, the university can function as a distributed interactive institution of a type, but until it has that technology in place, it's really not going to achieve the full potential. Now, ultimately, our vision for a distributed university serving a metropolitan area like Northern Virginia is that there are any number of ways that citizens could interact with the campus. And you wouldn't have just undergraduate and graduate students. You might have 3 or 4 classes of students. You might have 3 or 4 classes of communitarians who would interact with the campus for problem solving, for social activities and other things, cultural. All of those people could have the campus card, and they could pay for different types of activities and products and services using the campus card. And so it's really exciting to see how that kind of technology could be used to open up a university to the community and to enable business people, researchers, problem solvers, community leaders to draw on the resources of the university, both instructional, research, public service, and pay for them in different kinds of ways and be seen as a different kind of community. My vision of colleges and universities, and indeed of many types of organizations, is that they are going to be much more pervasive and open to different kinds of interactions. And the only thing that makes that possible will be information technology.
And if they don't really move in the direction of trying to get it quickly and efficiently with a long-term plan, they're going to have some problems, aren't they?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think many people believe that if colleges and universities don't act decisively on some of these issues, there are other organizations out there in society who also move and manage information, who can do a much better job, perhaps, at some of these things, that colleges and universities may lose some of the functions that they have picked up over the next 10 or 20 years. And of course, there's a debate on whether that's good or bad, but it's something that could happen.
Well, at this time, let's go to some questions and answers from our audience. We're ready at any time that you are. By all means, call in and give us your questions. While we're waiting for it, a lot of the things you talked about here take some time, but I bet you the Medical Association effort had to be done in a much quicker time frame.
It had to happen very quickly. And so there are several reasons for that, among them being that the pace of change in healthcare right now is accelerating rapidly in anticipation of healthcare reform. And there are things going on in all medical fields now that are substantial, relating to the consolidation of care delivery and to changes in the financial relationships. Many of them anticipating healthcare reform or even trying to head it off and eliminate some of the needs and problems that are stimulating it. And it's very important for an organization in that kind of environment to realize that suddenly the speed of the assembly line has changed and the practices that worked 3 years ago don't work anymore.
We have a question now from Barbara Stover. Barbara, we're ready for your question.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Norris. Do you have formulas for writing or developing key performance measures, and what relationship do they have to the behavioral objectives we used to write for educational purposes? Thanks.
Well, that is a good question. The intent of one intent of what you're asking is whether KPIs are just old wine in new bottles, and they can be, but fortunately in most cases, if they're well defined, they're not. There's no set formula, Barbara, for developing them. It depends on the situation. I've developed KPIs for organizations that are very specific. For example, that would, in David's area, that would relate to the specific areas of student service and identify what customer expectations are and drive it based on that. I've seen technology-based KPIs that related to the kind of functionality that you wanted to have and the expectations about the roles of users, for example, in being able to develop their own applications and capabilities. I've seen hierarchies of KPIs beginning with these kinds of things, and then if you could understand the way that technology was going to be used to transform the institution, building them up to institutional level KPIs, including financial performance that would be affected, so that you demonstrated how the technology was going to have an impact on the institutional level performance. It all depends on how clearly you understand the relationships between the transforming technologies and the things that you want to achieve in the organization.
We have online Katherine Hayes. Katherine, would you like to raise your question?
Sure. I have a question for Mr. Hollowell. We see a lot of the problems that you've described at the University of Delaware here at GW, and I've seen them at other universities as well. Do you think that this is a result of universities not being client-oriented, as Dr. Norris described, or due to some other reasons, such as simply bureaucracy?
I think it has some to do with not being as client-oriented as institutions need to be, and I think that most institutions of higher education went through a fairly extended period of growth and not having to worry about, the more students wanting to get in than they had seats. And I think in a number of institutions that led to complacency and lack of attention to the customer, which is the student. And that has changed as the student population has decreased. And the other thing I also think is because of the technology. The old batch-oriented technologies have not been updated in a lot of institutions, like deferred maintenance of plant, to get deferred maintenance of systems, and that the staff don't have the tools that the more modern systems provide.
We have Julie Davis on the phone. Julie?
Hi. I've really appreciated hearing some of your comments about how you've really concentrated on getting people to buy into the changes that you're making, that you're recognizing how important attitudes and organizational culture are in all of this. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this particular issue that I've thought a lot about myself. I believe that one of the major things with the information systems and the changes that are happening is that senior management and managers in general have to let go more, have to trust their people more. I see you shaking your heads. I guess you agree. Can you address this whole issue of information and power and letting go and all that? Thank you.
Absolutely, I think is the simple answer to your question. And part of it is having reliable tools available to the staff to be able to do the job. I mean, if you know that they're all going to have access to the right information, that makes it easier to let go. And it's also part of training and making sure expectations are clear. The communication, we've taken that all very, very seriously, and it really has paid off. I mean, the staff is happier. I mean, part of, I think, that when a person is sitting there with a student across them who probably is very unhappy with something, and you'd like to be able to help them, but if you can't, then what do? You try to pass them off to somebody else. You're much more satisfied if you can calm them down and give them the right answer and get them on their way with their problem solved. And that's what we've been trying to provide, enable people to do that.
One of the important points in this whole discussion has to do with really being able to understand how you have to orchestrate the staff and your clients and all the people that are going to be impacted by this. My question is to Don. Don, tell me, is it possible economically to bring all these people together in the long run? Is there a real payoff in putting these kinds of plans together?
Well, you can't afford not to. I don't think there's any question that the kind of activities that David has described, that I've described, lead to a substantial enhancement in productivity, which gets translated into the ability to undertake new activities, the ability to, in some cases, operate with a smaller staff, but more importantly, to redirect your resources to initiatives that you have not been able to undertake in the past because of limitations in times and resource. So the time that you invest in this pays for itself many times. And the other side of it is, if you're in any kind of a competitive industry these days facing world-class competitors, I can guarantee you that your competitors are doing this and are re-engineering, recrafting, enhancing productivity, and basically changing the nature of their enterprise. And if you are in an industry that is knowledge-based, and a knowledge-based industry, and are not doing these kinds of things, you are really headed for the dustpan of history, because everybody is doing it, and knowledge-based organizations have to function at a very high level of productivity and a very high level of value added. And the way to do that is through these kinds of transformational and re-engineering processes. And it's being pretty much accepted as standard operating procedure in those kinds of organizations.
Your statement that if they don't do it, they may fail, I find rather intriguing. Is anybody going to make it out of this whole technology bit without doing this kind of planning?
Well, if you're in a knowledge-based, technology-based industry or area of endeavor, you have tremendous risks. The pace of change is accelerating. Life cycles are shortening. Success 1 year is no guarantee that you'll be successful in 10 years. Look at IBM and a host of others. But if you don't change and don't read the realignments that are necessary in the environment to the environment and make them, you're going to fail.
We have a short question from Stephen Davis. Stephen?
Can you hear me? Yes, okay, we're there. David, I guess the question is at Delaware, how did you bring along those people that were reluctant to bring along, particularly in upper administration? Because after all, you have the questions of tenure and contract, and not everybody came along happily, did they?
Well, administrators aren't tenured, so I did have some leverage. But it was much more of an issue of helping them understand the issues and why these things were necessary. I mean, part of it, even being an administrator, part of my role is to be a teacher, and trying to communicate effectively what it would mean not only to do it, but what would mean not to do it, and how the institution could be put in a competitive disadvantage. How going into tighter budget times, if we couldn't make these things more efficient, then it would mean they'd have to eliminate more personnel. There are ways to convince people to do things without having to threaten to fire them, but that was always an option.
Thank you very much. We're going to now go to our final case study, and we're, in just a minute. And at that time, we're going to have a presentation on our SMP. Thank you. In our last phase tonight, we have with us Cathy Bridwell. Cathy's a distance educator specialist working for a government agency and has had a lot of experience in planning for technology. What we're going to ask Cathy to do is to talk about her strategic management plan and to give us some idea how she put it together, the kind of ideas behind it. We're also going to ask if she's had the opportunity in watching Don Norris and David Hollowell to give us some appraisal of what she thought that she could use based on some of the ideas. Cathy?
Well, first of all, a couple of the questions that came in from some of my fellow classmates caused me to think about my own SMP even as we were talking. And Jane Noel's question about being in a very small area and trying to have things sort of trickle up, and that really applies to my project. It's a very small piece of a much larger puzzle, and I'm hoping that the planning work that I do on this small piece will have an impact on some of the other processes. Basically, just in a nutshell, my project goal is to create a section within an information system that will be user-friendly and relevant to distance educators and those seeking more information about distance education. So as you can see, it's a very small piece of a much larger pie, and we're looking at this particular piece as a model, not only as a model for the way other areas of the system will be put together, but also as a model for planning and in the way those other systems are developed. And the strategy or some of the elements that we're looking at is to design for user access everything that I've heard tonight from Mr. Hollowell and Dr. Norris's, the sorts of things that we're talking about, user access, client access, also, of course, information collection, which is the content of the entire thing, the design for a policy for maintaining and updating that particular piece, and then finally a marketing strategy. I thought when Mr. Hollowell was talking, I thought about all of the wonderful things that are going on there, and I was really hoping that those things were being translated into letting people know that those had happened, because I think sometimes when we do this planning and we have good results, we forget to tell people. That whatever we have exists, and to help people to be able to create access that way, in other words. So that's sort of where I am, and the place that I think that I'm going to have to do the most work on this is designing the KPIs, and I guess Barbara Stover's question was right on where I am right now, and that's how to design measurable outcomes, or even beyond that, how to know, whether we've hit them once we've designed them. And I sort of liken this whole process to an instructional design process that most of us use, and I guess that's sort of where we are, and I guess I'll stop there, and maybe we can discuss ways that the KPIs could be developed for this particular project.
How long will you have to put this whole thing together before it has to work, Cathy?
Well, we're running on a short timeline. I think that, not to mention the fact that we have to have it done by the end of the semester, I think that's part of the reality of the whole thing. But I think that by the end of this semester would be a good timeline to have it wrapped up. And I think that that's enough time to get the sort of input from the users that we need, because I think it's going to be imperative that this thing is not designed by me, but that it's designed by a team, and that it's designed by the type of people that will be using it.
How many people are going to be involved in helping you to decide on what you expect as results for what you're doing?
Well, there's 2 of us that have been assigned this. Actually, 3 of us that have been assigned this as a part of our jobs. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to bring a lot of other people in, and particularly the users. But there's myself, who's an instructional design person. There's a technologist, who is a programmer responsible for administration of the whole system, and then a person whose major background is marketing. And so between the 3 of us, we'll have the major responsibility, but we'll also have to seek input from other people as well.
Will you be in a position where you outline to all the team, I'm going to call them a team, that are going to participate in this, what your expectations are? How will the initial set of expectations be assembled with that whole group?
Well, the expectations are, as we've said, are very vague, and they've come to us from the people who are in management, and that is that user friendliness, relevance, that sort of thing. So those are sort of the criteria that have been put upon us, and then as a team, we're going to have to develop the specifics within there. So, and I would not use me. I feel very strongly that this has to be developed as a team and not as my project, for example.
Model.
Exactly.
Right. Tell us a little bit about why you think that is so important.
Well, I think that almost everything we've learned in this class points to the fact that if you don't have a lot of people on board, for example, the technology specialist, if we don't have that person on board, the changes are not going to be implemented. I mean, that's a gatekeeper, a potential gatekeeper. And without that person buying into not only the concept of what we're doing, but the process, we're at a dead end, because that person holds the knowledge of the programming of this particular piece. So that's one example of why we have to have a team in this whole thing.
What were some of the points that were brought out in the presentation this evening that you thought were really important as you go along and develop your SMP?
Well, it's interesting, the idea of outcomes versus tasks. it would be so easy to fall into the trap of tasks with this whole thing. And I think we're going to have to avoid that. And even as I was sitting there listening, I was thinking about how task-oriented.
Another point that struck me that when I was listening to you talk about your S&P is the customer orientation. Talk a little bit about how you perceive that.
Well, if this whole thing is to be used and used effectively, it's going to have to be something those people want. And we talk about how we measure whether or not this particular system is a success, and it's not a measurement of how many hits we get, but whether or not the people that come in stay in because they like what they see, or that they get relevant information that they can use.
Now, describe a minute what a hit is, and you know how that works.
Right. For example, the technology is there so that we can know exactly how many people access this
Access the information.
Access the information. And actually, it's a little less sophisticated than that. It's not how many individuals, but how many different times different people have accessed this particular system.
It could be the same person, but multiple times.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the other thing we could measure is whether or not the system goes down, that sort of thing. But for this particular project, we're more interested in whether or not those people that came in found the information relevant and usable. The other thing that we would like to be able to do is open it up so that the people who are actually using the system can contribute to the information base. The other trap we want to avoid is having a whole lot of information in there and being proud of the fact that we have quantity, and we have to be very, I think that's another trap that we could fall into.
What about also the look and feel? How are you going to get that kind of involvement to predict what the user wants in that area?
I think we're going to have to go to some of those users and ask them to try some prototyping. I think that's going to be crucial. The trap that I have fallen into in past projects is becoming so close to the project that you intuitively know what it's going to be, and then when it's released, you find out that nobody understood the connection between the main menu and where to go to get the other information.
Except you. You understood.
And I understood that, exactly right.
Do you have a lot of potential users of the system?
Well, that's the interesting thing. The one thing that Dr. Norris talked about was finding out who your customers really are. And that just set off something in my head. I thought, well, we think we know who those people are, but I'm sure that there's a whole lot of people that we haven't even thought of that are our customers. And
potential customers.
Exactly.
Exactly, especially since the one advantage we do have with this system is it is an open architecture available on the internet. There will be people coming in from all over doing hits, and it's vital that we think about not just the people that we work with or work for, but all of those other people who don't know anything about our organization who are going to be coming into the system. And we can also use this as a tool to do some marketing of our organization as well.
That really struck me as something a little bit unique about the actual marketing aspect and incorporating that into your S&P. Why do you feel marketing is important?
Well, I think we could design the best system in the world, but if nobody knows it's there, it was just a waste of time.
Good point.
Yeah. Boy, I like that point.
I do
like
too.
It sounds simple. The other, I tell you, I'd like to take credit for that, but the fact is, I've got a marketing person on the team who
really
brings that.
So you're not really just looking at your customer base as it's out there right now. You're looking down the road and really vastly expanding that customer base.
The other thing is that this particular section can create demand for our programs, and it has that added benefit. So it's vital.
I'd like to go on and let some of the students ask a question if they want to. We can go on with this point. It's a pretty good point. What I'd like to do now is to provide an opportunity for the other students who are out there to ask a few questions. Please call in. We'd like your questions right now.
And while you're calling in, we'll go ahead and keep asking their questions until the time's up.
The thing that interests me about this is that you can work with a whole group of people, and you say they're my clients and I really understand them, and then somebody comes along and says, well, what are the demographics of all of your users of the system? And all of a sudden you say, well, here's what they are. And they say, well, are you sure that these are the real characteristics of the people that are using the system? And then you begin to raise questions with yourself.
Well, and even beyond the demographics, what are these people's learning styles?
Precisely.
I mean, it does, to some extent, it doesn't, we know some of the things about these peoples that we're probably dealing with an educated audience. There's some of that kind of demographic information that we know. But more importantly, I mean, what is it about these people that's going to make this system easy for them to use? And from a content standpoint, what is it that they really, I guess, you know, we talked earlier, Barbara Stover just hit it on the head, this whole thing about behavioral objectives. What is it that these people are going to be able to do, see, feel, whatever after they get this information, besides the fact that they got it? And that, I'm not quite sure how in the world we're going to measure that one. That's going to be a tough one.
Well, we've been in a number of online services, and some are a heck of a lot easier to use than others, and some have a lot more valuable, you know, the way they present the data really just drives home that, you know, that's the product you want to use. You know, and that's probably critical in your case also.
One of the problems you have when you have a large client base is that you can't ask everybody the same type of question. You can't give everybody the same questionnaire. And what they do sometimes is that they might, in order to get back the responses, is you can ask 1 or 2 questions of a person and spread your questions out over a large number of people and statistically put that information together. And it does work if you do it that way. That's
what else in the presentation tonight struck you?
Well, I guess the key concepts that we've been thinking about in our own organization, the whole idea of shifting the locus of control. And for this particular project, we can't be the key, well, there's two. There's first is the actual information contained within the project. But the second is in designing this particular system, or this, not the system, but the part of the system, we want to sort of design ourselves out of a job. In other words, people should be able to not to have also some control within this system as well. I mean, obviously the buck has to stop somewhere, but if every time someone wants to design another section, they come back to our team, we probably haven't done a very good job of empowering other people to use a process.
Yeah.
I guess part of the under the table idea in this whole process is to demonstrate in a very small place how an instructional design or strategic planning process can work, and then the other sections can be designed that way as well.
Exactly. We have Flora Russell on the phone. Flora, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question for anyone.
Okay.
I'm involved in a project on my job where we have designed and implemented a local area network, sort of without the support of management. I'll say upper management, but my immediate supervision and folk at that level have been the people who've been pushing it. We're at a point now that we need to get everyone to buy into sort of changing the way we do business in some cases, and we're having a difficult time doing that. Do you have any suggestions or recommendations of ways we can get everyone in our group to buy into changing the way we do business and supporting our new technology?
Well, I think one way is to make sure that they really understand what you intend to accomplish. And I don't know if that's been done or not in the way you've set it up. Of course, I could always ask the other question, Flora, and that is, did you bring everybody into the process when you first started out to put it together? It sounds like you have a top-level commitment, or at least that's what I'm hearing, but you don't have the commitment of all the people who are now have to implement it, and that's a tough one.
What they have to do in that case is they've got to find a common cause to use that local area network, whether it's email or word processing or form letters or something that's gonna get everybody to use that network in a productive manner, and then really go through an intensive training process to get everybody to understand the purpose of that network and that it's there to help them and it's a tool for them to use to make them more productive and more efficient. And it's going to require a lot of training on their part, yes. And it's going to require some type of common cause out there that is going to be the catalyst for them to go ahead and move forward in a local area network environment.
The hook. What's the hook?
Right.
We have found in some of the things that I've done that if somebody wanted some information or wanted to do something badly enough, that was the hook to get them into using a system such as the one we're trying to put together. If there are obviously a certain few adopters who are just excited about anything new, but for the majority of people, there has to be something in it for them. And I think that goes back to the very first thing we're going to do in this whole project is look at what the need really is, not even who the audience really is, but what is the need out there. And we can only do that by asking the people who would be using it.
Right. Technology isn't any good just for technology's sake. There has to be a need out there for people to use it.
One of the problems we have, of course, is that it takes time, again, to put all these things together. And in the case of Flora, it depends how far along she is in the process. I think it's very difficult once you get into this whole process to implement it. Once the ideas have been formulated and they haven't been necessarily included in this process. And
well, yeah, you're behind the power curve a little bit.
Exactly.
You're definitely behind the power curve. You've got to get some intense training in there, and again, you've got, what Cathy was saying. You got to have a hook in there, because if it's just out there and there's no purpose or no need or no use for it, then people aren't going to be enthusiastic about it and get out there and use it.
One of the things that sort of struck me when Cathy was talking about her idea was that she's willing to sit down right now and to re-examine the whole process that she originally thought through. I think that takes quite a bit of courage to do that.
Well, and I think what Flora just said, it's never too late to involve people. I mean, you may not be in the ideal place, but it's not too late. Even if you've had a system implemented for 5, 10, whatever years, it's not too late to bring people on board. You're just going to have to work a lot harder to do it.
Exactly.
And right now, I like the idea that you said, well, look, I've got just a couple months, and within those couple months, I'm going to pull this all together. Is there any kind of advice, very, very quickly, you could give the audience about what you've learned so far that might help them in their own strategic management planning? Just a couple of points.
Well, I think the fact that I've come to you a couple times and to Barry throughout this process, throwing the ideas out, ask questions, be willing to examine, and I think everybody needs to do that. And also, I'm up for people on the bulletin board giving me some feedback that they may necessarily have wanted to give me during this class.
One of the things that's really important in this whole process is to be able to use the bulletin board, to use America Online, as your projects now are approved, to really put these various things together. And that's the thing that you really need to take into consideration.